May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It started on Wednesday. As people began to gear up for their Memorial Day weekend celebrations and adventures, many started to post on social media, Facebook, Twitter, their support for our troops. They posted beautiful images and tear-provoking stories of how we honor those who've given the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms. All weekend long, these posts will be shared and reshared. Cover photos will be updated to show the American flag, and profile photos will be updated with the images of loved ones who've served. Memorial Day was initially known as Decoration Day, to honor those who died in the American Civil War in 1868 with flowers placed on the graves of the Union and Confederate soldiers buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Since then, we have experienced World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, and many more conflicts named and unnamed. This weekend, we honor all the American men and women who have died while serving in the United States Armed Forces. How do we experience Memorial Day in 2014? Some of us still visit graves and place flags and flowers, grave blankets and tributes. We also write posts of gratitude and prayers on social media. We attend and participate in town parades, and we have barbecues and parties to launch our summers. These are all good things to do. Good ways to honor our fallen soldiers and military personnel. It is good to pause and to honor those who have given the ultimate sacrifice in dying for our country. It is good to offer praise and prayers for those who risk themselves every day. It is good to celebrate our towns. For these people loved our towns so much, and they loved their homes so much, that they gave their lives to preserve them. And it is good to celebrate the coming of warmer, sunnier days as an homage to days of peace without worry. This all truly is good. But let us not honor only those who are buried. Not all deaths are physical. Let us remember and honor the other sacrifices men and women make when they join the military. Some people experience deep trauma during their military training. Some make it through training and then experience deep trauma during their deployment. Some come home with damaged bodies, damaged minds, and/or addictions. Addictions are not limited to drugs and alcohol. Some return addicted to an extreme sense of order and control. Some are addicted to the adrenaline of extreme experience, or even addicted to the idealized version of their families, that all is the same as it was before, no one has aged, and no one has changed. The families of military personnel live through their own traumas, through separation from their loved ones for long periods of time, through isolation because military personnel often cannot share the details of the work or their whereabouts, through fear because they're afraid of loss, dangerous situations, and of the unknown for their loved ones, and through dysfunction. The family unit changes, parenting changes, relationships change. I am a child of a military family. I have lived through all of these sacrifices. My father joined the Army just out of high school during World War II. He was wounded in Europe with shrapnel throughout one side of his body, and suffered not just because of the physical injuries, but also because of the morphine addiction he developed as a result of his VA hospital treatment. During his recovery, he met my mother. She was a young war widow with an infant son, and she was volunteering at a rehab center for wounded soldiers. They soon married and embarked on the life of a military family. Sometimes they were together, and sometimes they were apart. They lived in Japan as part of the occupying forces there, in Army bases in Pennsylvania and upstate New York, in Germany, and eventually settled back in the U.S. in New Mexico. My father worked his way up to the rank of major, and in New Mexico, he taught nuclear weapons assembly. As part of his work, he witnessed and photographed several nuclear tests in the Southwest desert. When I was a year old, the family moved to New Jersey, and Dad retired to civilian civil service as a nuclear weapons inspector. When I was 6, my father took a post in Seoul, Korea. He came home for a few weeks, 1 or 2 times a year, until I was about 8 years old, and then he stopped coming home. I never saw my father again, but he reached out to me when I was 26. He had moved back to El Paso, Texas, and wanted to form a relationship with his daughter via weekly phone calls. He did not tell me he came home to the United States to die. He died only a few months after reaching out to me of cancer and alcoholism. During our weekly calls, he had told me that most of his colleagues and friends had already died of the same diseases, but I somehow didn't realize he was telling me that he was dying too. I cannot explain in this short sermon how many sacrifices my father made in pursuing a career that he truly believed was his calling to preserve the safety of our country during the Cold War. I cannot explain the sacrifices my mother made in marrying into the family, into the military life. Some are obvious. She lost her first husband, the love of her life, who was a gunner, and his plane was shot down in flames over the Pacific. And some are not so obvious. She was left alone to raise 5 boys, a daughter, and her husband's grown niece. I cannot explain the sacrifices my brothers made, each of them with a different experience of my father and mother, and a life as a child abroad. These experiences each impacted their own adult decisions and choices. I can, however, offer a glimpse into the sacrifices that I made, simply by being born into this family. As a little girl, I wanted a father who was home at the end of the day. I wanted to know my father. I wanted to be loved by my father. Instead, when my dad visited after long absences, everyone expected me to know him and to run to him. But I did not know him, and I was afraid of him. I remember trembling in the car, sitting next to him, on the rides home from the Air Force Base upon his return. I remember crying when he'd leave again after a few weeks' visit because I'd just gotten used to him moving around. What would have helped me as a child? How can we as Christians really honor today's military and their families? Not just the families who've suffered loss through physical death, but also the families who suffer loss through the many deaths caused by trauma. We can honor them simply through the ministry of presence. Ask without prying. Listen actively. Create space for the family just to be. Create space for laughter, as well as unashamed tears. And honor their sacrifices by being the best Americans we can be, striving for a just and good and honorable country. On January 20th, 2014, David Brooks wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times titled "The Art of Presence." This piece summed up the actions of the Ministry of Presence as told through Catherine Woodward's blog, A New Normal, 10 Things I've Learned Through Trauma. The family experience was not related to battle injuries or military involvement, but the lessons learned about the Ministry of Presence are the same. In fact, they can be applied to any situation where we are called to help a person who is suffering. David Brooks writes that the victims of trauma experience days when you feel like a quivering, cowardly shell of yourself, when despair yawns as a terrible chasm, when fear paralyzes any chance for pleasure. This is just a fight that has to be won over and over and over again. Catherine's mother, Mary, talks about the deep organic grief that a parent feels when they have lost a child and seen another badly injured, a pain that is felt in the bones and in their very fiber. But suffering is a teacher, and among other things, the Woodwardses drew a few lessons which at least apply to their own experience, about how those of us outside the zone of trauma might better communicate with those inside the zone. There is no uniformly right response, but there are collective wisdom, some of it contained in Catherine's Sojourner piece. and it's all quite useful. Do be there. Some people think those who experience trauma need space to sort it out. Assume the opposite. Most people need presence. The Woodwardses say they are awed after each tragedy by the number of people, many of whom were mere acquaintances, showed up and offered love from across the nation and the continents. They were also disoriented by the number of close friends who simply weren't there because they were afraid or too busy. Anna and Catherine's father, Ashley, says that he could detect no pattern to help predict who would step up and who would be in the ministry of presence, and who would fumble. Age, experience, personal belief, nothing correlated with the sensitivity and love. Don't compare ever. Don't say, I understand what it's like to lose a child. My dog died and that was very hard. Even if the comparison seems more germane, don't make it. Each trauma should be respected in its own uniqueness. Each story should be shared attentively as its own thing. From the inside, Catherine writes, comparisons sting as clueless, careless, or just plain false. Do bring soup. The nonverbal expressions of love are as healing and as eloquence. When Mary was living with Catherine during her recovery, some young friend noticed she didn't have a bath mat. He went out to Target and bought a bath mat. Mary says she will never forget that. Do not say, you'll get over it. There's no such thing as getting over it, Catherine writes. A major disruption leaves a whole new normal in its wake, and there is no going back. Do be a builder. The Woodwardses distinguish between firefighters and builders. Firefighters drop in and arrive at the moment of crisis. Builders are there for years and years, walking alongside the victims to live out the world. Very few people are capable of being both. Don't say it's all for the best, or try to make sense of what has happened. Catherine and her parents speak with astonishing gentleness and quiet thoughtfulness, but it's pretty obvious that these tragedies have stripped them away of their tolerance for pretense or unrooted optimism. Ashley also warns against those who would be over-interpreting and try to make sense of the inexplicable. Even devout Christians, as the Woodwardses are, should worry about taking theology beyond its limits. Theology is a grounding and ultimate hope, not a formula to explain away an individual tragedy. David Brooks goes on to say that what these experiences call for us is a sort of passive activism. We have a tendency, especially in an achievement-oriented culture, to want to solve problems and repair brokenness, to propose, plan, fix, interpret, explain, and solve. But what seems to be needed here is the art of presence, to perform tasks without trying to control or alter the elemental situation. Allow nature to take its course. Grant the sufferers the dignity of their own process. Let them define the meaning. Sit simply through the moments of pain and uncomfortable darkness. Be practical, mundane, simple, and direct. What would have helped me as a child? What would have helped me when I was a young adult, trying to reconnect with my father only to lose him and endure the ongoing resentment of my family, built by the sacrifice of dysfunction? Having someone, some people, sitting with me and with my family in the ministry of presence would have helped. Job's friends sat quietly for 7 days and nights when they saw how great Job was suffering. They did not speak, but they remained present at Job's side. In 2 Corinthians, Paul reminds us that God is the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, consoling us so that we may be able to console others. For as Christ suffered for us, our consolation is abundant through Christ. Let us continue to honor our military for all their sacrifices. Let us continue to strive for a just and peaceful America by exercising our freedoms and our rights, the freedoms and rights our military personnel work so hard to preserve. And let us all strive to be passive activists, loving our family and our friends, neighbors and strangers, through our own developed ministry of presence. Amen.
Amen.
Dear God, please pray with me. Dear God, thank you for creating each of us as your beloved children. Thank you for all our blessings and for all our troubles, a continual process of being made perfect in our love for you and for each other. Thank you for the graces you bestow upon us so we may, in turn, be in ministry for our friends, our family, our neighbors, and for strangers. Amen.